Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this quick video. I will be going on the Model UN trip, so we missed class on Thursday and Friday. So I'm leaving you some questions that include some practice free response questions. These are questions that have like a part, 1, part 2, part 3. They're generally very short. They are not meant to be essay questions or anything like that. They're usually one word or one sentence answers, but oftentimes you're using a graph or you're drawing a graph. So the free response questions encourage us to think a little bit more graphically. And we already addressed supply and demand shifts. So some of the free response questions would have in them determinants of demand, determinants of supply, what happens if price changes and then there's no shift in supply and demand, just a movement along the curve. We also started to look at double shifts. What happens if there is a shift in demand at the same time? There might be a shift in supply. So there's a couple of things for you today and tomorrow to practice, and I'll include the answer keys so you can check your work. The newer concept that we're working on is, what happens when we have a government intervention, for example, like a price control, but this will also be similar with taxes and subsidies and tariffs and other types of government interventions on an economy. Sometimes we look to measure the effects of those interventions, which group do they affect, consumers or producers? And we also can compare an economy that's in a market that's allocatively efficient is producing at an equilibrium price where the quantity is where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded at that same given price. So say at a price of $3, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. That's the allocatively efficient quantity. Unless something changes and a demand or a supply curve shifts, we just look at, like in this case, QE is the allocative efficient quantity. If this market is producing any other quantity other than QE, it's either over allocating resources or under allocating resources to the good, right? Not producing enough, or it's producing too much and maybe not enough of something else, okay? One way that we can work with understanding an efficient and allocatively efficient economy is by suggesting that for there to be allocative efficiency, we're going to see maximized surplus, okay? And for now, we're going to define surplus as considering consumer surplus and producer surplus, okay? And this is given on price PC. We know that there's a great amount of consumer surplus. For every quantity less than quantity QE, there's some purchases on the quantity demanded, right? Some purchases that are demanded where the price that someone is willing to pay is much greater than the price that they actually pay, okay? It's almost like that feeling when you go to the store and you get, a really good deal on something and you feel like you have extra purchasing power. We're describing that as consumer surplus, right? And because we're not using calculus, we're going to kind of quantify consumer surplus as for every quantity less than QE and equal to QE, what is the dollar amount of consumer surplus that we see for every quantity demanded? Okay, so for the first quantity demanded, how much is somebody willing to pay? What is the price that they actually pay, and so on, okay? So consumer surplus is measured in dollars, and for our purposes, we can use the area of a triangle to actually figure out consumer surplus. It's always going to be below the demand curve, the shaded area below the demand curve up until the equilibrium quantity, and the bottom of your consumer surplus triangle will always be the equilibrium price, okay? And of course, consumer surplus can change shape if the price changes or something else changes. Likewise, producer surplus is looking at the bottom part of the producer surplus, triangle or trapezoid or whatever shape it tends to be. You're going to see the supply curve, right? Because that's the amount that producers generally pay to produce the good, right? But they too may get a price that's much higher than what they actually paid to produce the good. And of course, the higher the price, the more producer surplus. So all the way up until quantity QE, we can measure in dollars and quantify the degree of producer surplus. Okay, we defined this last time. We looked at what the definitions were, so I'll just kind of put these up so you have it. We had a nice little acting gig from Annika and from Michelle, so that was nice. We got a chance to see. And this is consumer and producer surplus. Okay, and so of course we could actually quantify this. I know that consumer surplus, in this case, if the quantity that's allocatively efficient is a quantity of 10, let's say 10 water bottles, and the equilibrium price is $5. So everybody in this market is going to be buying and selling water bottles at the equilibrium price of $5, right? But there are certainly some consumers who are willing to pay $10, $9.75, $9.50, and so on, all the way along the demand curve, all the way until $5, right? So that's how we're capturing our consumer surplus. In the area of a triangle, 1/2 times base times height, you can quantify your consumer surplus, okay? So we'll do that in a second. Here is our producer surplus. Oftentimes, an economy that's allocative efficient is producing the allocatively efficient quantity, in this case, quantity of 10, we might see maximized consumer surplus and producer surplus, okay? And so if we wanted to quantify this, we can just look at quantifying the area using either consumer surplus. Sometimes you're asked to shade consumer surplus. Sometimes you're asked to quantify consumer surplus, which of course you can really only do if you're given numbers on the X and Y axis. In this case, you can also quantify producer surplus, and sometimes you're asked for total surplus, and that would include, at this point, consumer surplus and producer surplus together, okay, maximum surplus. If we wanted to do this, we would quantify consumer surplus at 25. So we know that, 10 minus 5 is 5. 5 times 10 divided by 2 gives me 25. So 1/2 times base times height of that consumer surplus triangle. We're doing a little bit of geometry using the numbers here. Okay, and the same thing with producer surplus, right? We're just looking at some different numbers, but you could quantify producer surplus at $20, and that's how it would be measured in dollars. The difference between 1 and 5 is 4. 4 times 10 would be then divided in half, and you'd get the producer surplus of 20. Our total surplus, of course, is $45. Okay, so that's a way of looking at consumer and producer surplus. The concept we didn't get to is really understanding deadweight loss. So that's why I wanted to do this quick video. Deadweight loss is going to be important because whenever there's a government intervention, we tend to see a degree of inefficiency, and we like to showcase that. What does that look like? Who benefits or doesn't benefit from that? So what does this look like? And we can use a price control as an example. Okay, so let's put in a price floor. Okay, this is a price floor, a price that's going to be above the equilibrium price, PC. We're going to call this a binding price floor. That means the government has issued a law, and this is how it is. There's no changing it, so there's no movement back to the equilibrium price of PC. And we also know that once we've increased the price, we've moved along both the supply curve and the demand curve. So now we have a different quantity supplied and a different quantity demanded. And in this case, they're not at equilibrium, right? So quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and we would have a surplus of goods, okay? We've also noted, there's our price floor, that when we have a price floor, the quantity that actually gets transacted in this market, it's no longer the allocative efficient quantity of QE, because now we don't have quantity demanded equaling quantity supplied. We've increased the price, and the incentives have changed for consumers and for producers. So now that we have this greater price, we have a situation where we're producing a quantity that's going to be less than QE. It's the quantity, at the floor, the price floor. And so we are going to be under allocating in this economy. We're not producing the allocatively efficient quantity. And as a result, that's going to affect our consumer and our producer surplus. In order to measure consumer surplus, we can look at the demand curve up until the quantity that is produced. But we also need to look at the price, okay? So in this case, this is our consumer surplus, okay? It's smaller than before. We've lost like this entire, area here, the bottom part of the triangle, is no longer consumer surplus, right? Because these consumers on this part of the demand curve are no longer able to purchase goods, right? We see an increase in price leads to, reduction in the purchasing of goods, right? There's not enough demand. We can measure our producer surplus. The producers have kind of increased, perhaps. We could argue, at least we don't know if they've increased their surplus. It's a little indeterminate. They have received a higher price. So sometimes the benefit could be seen for the producer. But of course, the producer is also selling less than they were before, and they could be selling significantly less, and that could be a problem. So even though the producer sees a higher price, it may be actually affecting the producer more that they have a lower quantity. This wacky triangle that we see here, so that we have our consumer surplus and our producer surplus, and our total surplus is not going to be the same. It's going to be less. We know it's going to be less because we're going to have this triangle where there's no transactions happening. This part of the demand curve and this part of the supply curve where, up until like between quantity floor price and the quantity of allocative efficiency, we have like kind of some dead space with no surplus. Consumers aren't benefiting from that because they're not making purchases. Producers are not selling goods, so they're not benefiting from that. We're going to call that deadweight loss, okay? Deadweight loss is basically a sign of inefficiency. It basically means lost consumer and producer surplus, okay? As soon as we see inefficiency, economists hate this because they say inefficiency means the market is not pumping out the allocatively efficient quantity. That's the purpose of the market. It's the benefit of the market and what the market's supposed to do. It's still possible that producers benefit from this in some way. Maybe to some degree that higher price is serving better than the reduction in quantity. Maybe there's some other program that's affecting their quantity. So there's like lots of ways that sometimes price controls happen. Politically, they're oftentimes, really important, but they do create a degree of inefficiency, okay? And so economists would say it's inefficient and it's problematic, okay? If you look at also a price ceiling, and you can try this, you will find very much the same thing, okay? Check out the reading about deadweight loss, check out some of the practice free response questions, and of course, we will work on this in class when I see you next.